Numéro 3, S-269.
Number 3, S-241.
Honourable Senators, I move that this bill be read a third time.
L'honorable sénatrice Deacon Ontario propose.
It is moved by Honourable Senator Deacon Ontario and seconded by Honourable Senator that the bill be read a third time. On debate, Senator Deacon Ontario.
First, congratulations to my colleague, Senator Boyer, this evening. Very, very profound news. I rise today to speak to a third reading of Bill S-269, an act respecting a national framework on the advertising for sports betting. I had the privilege of being a member of the Transport Comms Committee looking at this bill, and I want to thank members of steering for bringing forward so many expert witnesses, and to our chair and co-chair for facilitating some fascinating discussions. I'd also like to thank the other members of the committee for their thoughtful questions, as well as for allowing me to be part of one of the fastest clause-by-clauses I've been part of. Hopefully, this will be a positive sign. As I did during my second reading speech, I do want to give a bit of background. We've had many new senators arrive, and it is important to remember what brought us here. In 2021, Parliament passed C-218, which amended the Criminal Code by removing the long-standing prohibition on betting on the outcome of any race or fight or on a single sporting event or athletic contest. The passage of this bill was introduced by Conservatives and was many years in the making. Prior iterations included Bill C-290, introduced in 2011, which made it to third reading in the Senate before Parliament was prorogued in the fall of 2013. Two other iterations of the bill were brought forward in the House, with elections hampering one of their journeys when it made it to the Senate. It's also worth noting that the Trudeau government also introduced their own single sports bill legislation in 2020, Bill C-13. Given its similarities to Bill C-218, though the government withdrew it. And why so many efforts to make single sports betting legal? The argument was this was happening anyway in the illicit underground markets, many of which were offshore, so why not regulate it and bring it into the light of day with tax revenue within Canada? A majority of us at the time agreed and voted in favour of C-218, including myself. I supported this bill and still do so far. That was what was happening inside the Senate. My life outside the Senate was also, frankly, informing me. In my international work, I've been exposed to the dark side of sport in amateur sport. That was match fixing, which we now call match manipulation. In the 2012 Olympics in London, this was exposed live on television. Athletes were told to fix matches by their coaches. This runs deep in other parts of the world, is a huge business, and has presence also in Canada. As I became a senator, I finished an obligation to host my final World Championship in Canada. 60 countries, 800 athletes. We worked with the IOC on a sport integrity program, and on Canadian soil, with our Canadian values, an athlete could not step on the field of play in Markham, Ontario, unless they completed this program that focused on match manipulation and doping. During that time, I also learned about athlete grooming. Athletes are lured into manipulating matches or being part of a taker on a winning bet. I knew I had to turn every stone I could on this. As a result of 218 being passed, the prohibition was removed. It was left to the provinces to determine if they would open their market to private betting companies. In 2021, Ontario did so and opened its iGaming market, remaining the only province to do so thus far, though Alberta seems to be on the cusp of doing so themselves. One unintended consequence of all of this, or not seen perhaps as the degree of consequence, was, of course, the ads. We've all seen them. Canadians across the countries have seen them. According to Raffaello Rossi, a lecturer in marketing at the University of Bristol, who appeared before our committee, research he conducted with CBC found that viewers are subject to 3 gambling ads a minute when watching sports on network TV. This did not go unnoticed by Canadians, and it didn't take long for them to get sick and tired of them. A survey conducted by the Mahu Group in February found that 75% of Canadians said there's a need to protect children and youth from sports betting ads. 66% said that those commercials should not be allowed during live broadcasts, and 59% believe a nationwide ban on the ads should be implemented immediately. Many betting companies also post ads on their social media feeds. These are directed primarily at children and youth, many whom are underage. The underlying message of these ads is that betting is an integral part of sports, which, as a strong supporter of sport, I find offensive. At first, the ads were egregious. Hockey legends and celebrities continue flashed across the screens of anyone who dared sit in their living room to watch a game. Or encouragingly, the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario introduced some further regulations in 2023, including the prohibition of athletes or celebrities in these ads. But there was a huge caveat. They can still appear if the ads have a message of responsible gaming. As one witness put to us in committee, they're still branded ads. It's a very convenient approach to be able to say, we're going to inundate you with ads and opportunities to gamble. Now just do it responsibly, and you're going to be okay. But the responsible gaming messages are usually buried in small type at the bottom of ads and present none of the documented risks of gambling addiction. Evidence shows instead, colleagues, that explicitly advertising the risks, like we see on cigarette packages, are much more effective. These are the best practices out there, but we have not seen them here yet. We also have the matter of the entire country being subject to the whims of advertising from just one province. I remind you that thus far, single-game sport betting with the companies whose ads you are seeing is only legal in Ontario. This creates a lot of problems. As Will Hill, the executive director of the Canadian Lottery Coalition, told our committee, quote, when a player in a different province than Ontario sees one of these ads on Hockey Night in Canada during one of the intermission and then goes to log on their computer and on their sports news website of choice, there's a digital banner with an operator. They actually develop the perception that it must be legal. If I've seen it on TV, and if I see it there on my computer while I'm sitting in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, or elsewhere, if it's coming to me, then there must be some legitimacy to it. There's a sheen of legality and authenticity implied by advertising that goes beyond Ontario. In the meantime, what is to stop someone from going to the illicit market after being nudged by an ad? The very illicit market that this bill was set up to combat. These ads, as I will outline later, also cause harms in themselves to youth and other vulnerable populations. Why should the lax regulations in one province subject the rest of the country to these ads when their own provinces have decided quite rightly that they can be harmful? Which brings us to Bill S-269 and why I introduced it. Let's start with what this legislation won't do. It will not ban gambling ads completely. After a great deal of many months of consultation with the law clerk's office, reviewing cases, and listening to constitutional experts like our colleague, Senator Cotter, it was decided that the harms of gambling ads may not reach the threshold of the harm that we see in cigarettes, which after decades of court battles are effectively banned from advertising. That's the bar a ban would have to clear before the Supreme Court. And while a ban was my initial aspiration and approach, we decided it was prudent here to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. What this bill will do instead is require the Minister of Heritage to develop a national framework on the advertising of sports betting. The minister must, 1, identify measures to regulate the advertising of sport betting in Canada with a view to restricting the use of such advertising, limiting the number, scope, or location, or a combination of these, of the advertisements, or to limiting or banning the participation of celebrities and athletes in the promotion of sports betting. 2, identifying measures to promote research and intergovernmental information sharing in relation to the prevention and diagnosis of minors involved in harmful gambling activities and to support measures for those who are impacted by it. And number 3, set out national standards for the prevention and diagnosis of harmful gambling and addiction for support measures for those who are impacted by it. In doing this, the minister must consult with the Ministry of Industry, Justice, Health, Employment and Social Development, the Minister responsible for mental health and addictions, the Minister of Indigenous Services, and any other ministers who, in the minister's opinion, have relevant responsibilities at that time. Must consult representatives of the provincial and territorial governments, including those responsible for consumer affairs, health, mental health, and addictions. Must consult with relevant stakeholders, including health advocates, service providers, representatives from medical and research communities, and organizations within the advertising and gambling industries that the minister considers to have relevant experience and expertise related to problematic gambling activities and the role of advertisements pertaining to gambling activities. Must consult with Indigenous communities and organizations with Indigenous leadership and any other person or entity the minister considers appropriate. Lastly, this legislation also refers to CRTC. Section 6 states the CRTC must review its regulations and policies to assess their adequacy and effectiveness in reducing the incidence of harms resulting from the proliferation of advertising of sports event betting. It must report, when we look at accountability, it must report its conclusions and recommendations to the minister no later than the first anniversary of the day on which this Act receives royal assent, who in turn must cause the report to be tabled in each House of Parliament within the first 15 days on which the House is sitting after the day on which they receive the report. Makes your head spin this time of day, I'm sure. In doing this, this legislation seeks to put some guardrails around these sports betting ads because, as we all know, gambling can cause great harms to individuals and society. International research ahead of us shows conclusively the most effective single tool to limit the harm from sports betting and other forms of gambling is to limit the ads. The vast majority of sports betting happens in the palm of your hand, and as we heard from the Canadian Association on Mental Health, online gambling is immensely problematic. Online gambling is more common among people who gamble frequently, and for some, this form of gambling can significantly contribute to gambling problems. In fact, gambling online may be the single strongest risk factor for developing a gambling disorder. There is a causal relationship between exposure to gambling advertising and a more positive image of gambling, as well as intentions to gamble and actual gambling activity. Children and youth, as well as those already experiencing gambling problems, are especially vulnerable, especially susceptible to these effects. For the problematic gambler, the recidivism rate is over 90%. Once addicted, it's almost impossible to stop. An alcoholic can avoid the bar, but for a gambling addict, the simple act of sitting down to watch a hockey game exposes you. As we've heard, advertisements and encouragements to gamble up to 3 times a minute. With a recidivism rate of 90%, the temptation would likely prove too much. Gambling harms can have grave consequences. There is, of course, the affordability aspect. Cardis, a Canadian think tank that appeared before committee, found that in Ontario, the average betting account spends $283 a month on betting. If it is just one account per player, which is unlikely, that accounts for 3.2% of average monthly household income in Canada. The net losses are therefore more than 3 times what experts consider safe, which is not more than 1% of a pre-tax household income. Research has shown that when players exceed 1%, they are 4.3 times more likely to experience financial harm like bankruptcy, 4.7 times more likely to experience relational harm like spousal abuse and divorce, and 3.9 times more likely to experience emotional or psychological harm, depression, anxiety, and so on. There's also harm to the economy. Recent research in the U.S. shows that households in states where gambling was legalized saw significantly reduced savings, as well as lower investments in assets like stocks that are generally considered more financially sound. We did hear a comment during committee about the low rates of those impacted and whether this bill was sweeping a little bit too far. But a small proportion of a large number is still a large number of people. In Canada, even with StatCan's pre-legalization estimate of 1.6% of gamblers at moderate to high risks of gambling disorders, that is still 304,000 people. International estimates are much higher. According to the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, each individual dealing with this addiction to gambling impacts 8 people around them, their siblings, partners, children, family, etc. Concerningly, since 2019, the rates of problematic gambling have gone up. For example, Matthew Young of Grio Insights told the committee that the number of people calling the Ontario Problem Gambling Hotline has increased significantly since 2021, driven primarily by calls associated with online gambling. In addition, a recent online survey conducted by the Mental Health Research Canada found that 7% of Canadians met the criteria for problem gambling. This represents more than a 1,000% increase since it was last assessed in 2018. And some of that data we just received as last Thursday evening. It's pretty recent data. Rates of problem gambling were even higher amongst younger children aged 18 to 34 years old, reaching 15%. What's worse, colleagues, is that gambling rates have gone up in our children. The Centre for Addiction and Mental Health said that students from grades 7 to 12 who have gambled online has increased from 4% in 2019 to 15% in 2021. Walk into a high school. Walk around the back of the high school. This is not hidden. Now, these kids may or not be betting on regulated sites, but that is also the secondary effect of all the ads we're seeing, that being the normalization of gambling as part of sport. For a generation of youth growing up watching their favorite athletes playing their favorite games, betting and gambling will be interwoven into the very way that they experience and enjoy sport. What would normally be joy at Connor McDavid scoring the winning goal for an Oilers fan could be spoiled because his lineman didn't score instead, as your prop bet predicted. The compunction to bet disembodies sports. It robs sport of the right cultural associations. This phenomenon was no more apparent than these past Summer Olympics. If you watched on TV, you were no doubt inundated with ads for a betting company. I took the opportunity to see what I could bet on. Anything, colleagues. Every Olympic event was offered as a possibility to make a loose or quick buck. This is wrong. As betting becomes so ingrained in sport through sponsorship, deals and ads, the very logos on some uniforms, it will permeate the spirit and intent of competition. Sport can be very powerful. It instills many positive values. It helps young people build skills for life. But it can't do that if it offers more opportunities to cheat or increase abuses. Increasingly, athletes are threatened and harassed online for not meeting the expectations of one bettor or another. To combat the ugliness and harm to college athletes, the NCAA in the United States recently called for a ban on so-called prop bets, bets within a game, on all of its games. As an Olympic leader, I find the possibility of harm to the amateur level, like the Olympics, and then allow it to be promoted regularly is, quite frankly, disgusting. These amateur athletes don't have the same platform as a professional. Many are young. Chinese skateboarder Zheng Hao was 11 when she entered the Park Bowl at Place de Concorde in Paris this summer, for instance. Let's act before the harm can extend to her and others like her. At committee, we of course heard some limitations this legislation could have. We know, for instance, the online space is harder to regulate. Advertising on social media can be targeted towards the most vulnerable. But I don't think we can completely discredit the effect regulations on traditional modes of advertising will have. Research done by the CRTC as recently as 2023 found that while the viewing of broadcast television, we know, has declined in recent years, Canadian youth aged 2 to 11 and 12 to 17 years still watch an average of 12.8 and 12.4 hours, respectively, of conventional television per week. When we look closer as well at online sports streaming, Canadian broadcast rights of the Big Four sport leagues in North America are owned by Rogers and Bell, who together make up roughly 70% of the online sports streaming landscape through Sportsnet and TSN, respectively. These online streams typically mirror what is seen on the cable TV channels right down to the ads. Also, colleagues, we heard from Think TV in committee, who said that the sport book companies are admirably already clearing their online ads with them to make sure they align with television broadcast standards. We've already seen this in practice historically with beer and spirit companies who typically don't make a separate set of ads for the online space and conform to the responsibility under the CRTC's Code for Broadcast Advertising of Alcoholic Beverages. Senators, only those who have vested interests in sport betting and gambling, the betting companies, the advertisers, the broadcasters, our letters from the CFL and the NHL, they oppose this legislation. Broadcasters who have enjoyed an influx of cash from these ads are, of course, hesitant to see ads further regulated, arguing these brands need to establish themselves and will naturally decrease their promotion over time. I take issue with this, of course. We are not banning ads completely for the reasons I've explained and gone over this evening. This is an industry that took in $2.4 billion in revenues last year. Surely they can afford to pay for creative ads that fit within a more reasonable and responsible approach that takes protections into consideration as much as profits. One argument that did not sit well with me was that we need to conduct more research to see if these ads are actually harmful, that we should let it play out before we try to rein it in. This, colleagues, is just too risky. A great deal of harm would be done if we take this approach because we know where this is going. Other countries who have had single sport betting and subsequent advertising for longer than we have are now moving to come down very hard on advertising and promotion. In response to excessive gambling marketing, various European countries have recently almost entirely banned marketing. That included Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Spain, Poland, and as of this year, Ukraine. Lord Michael Grain, who chaired a House of Lords committee in the UK on problematic gambling, was kind enough to share the UK experience with our committee. He told us, and I'll quote here, quote, "With the knowledge that you have of what has gone on around the world, most particularly in the UK, Australia, and other places, you would be in dereliction of duty. If I may be so bold, if you ignore this problem now that you have legalized it in the way that you have. This is a serious problem of regulation that you must address now. There are many case studies and case histories that will inform and help you to draw the line between restriction and freedom to gamble. You are coming at it. You are lucky in one respect that you have all of this case law and history from around the world that will help you to make the right decision, the decisions that are right for Canada." End of quote. And that, colleagues, is why I'm trying to address what I'm trying to address here with the legislation before us. I can't say for sure what this framework will look like if it passes, but with the case history we see, I trust we will see more reasonable limits placed on these ads, informed by existing research and best practices. After all, Canadians are begging for this, so the political will is there at all levels of government to get it right. Before I finish here, colleagues, I'd like to take a moment to thank Dr. Bruce Kidd from the University of Toronto and the campaign to ban ads for gambling, whose advocacy on behalf of our youth was very, very strong. His life's work has been indispensable in raising awareness not just for this legislation, but laying out the extent that we are facing at this moment in time. I also want to thank my colleague, Senator Cotter, who came aboard early in the drafting of this legislation, has advocated for in committee and in chamber. I'd like to thank my staff and the law clerks who did excellent work, particularly at the front end when we were mucking around to figure out how this bill would work best. They helped so much craft what we have before us today, and what I believe happens to be an important piece of legislation. Many experts out there certainly to acknowledge and thank, but today I think of the hundreds of conversations, informal conversations I've had with families, long letters of the stories of the impact of gambling on young people, dads particularly of young boys who are lost at what to do next and no longer know their sons. Many of them are watching this third reading this evening. Today I ask on behalf of so many for your support to vote for this bill. As senators, this is our work. Sober second thought. We supported, by numbers, a single sport betting bill. There was a problem with negative implications. We need to fix it and fix it quickly. Please help me get this one step closer and back to the House so we can get this right and soon. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Senator Lofreda.
Senator Deacon, thank you for your insightful speech, and I share your concerns. I agree that banning gambling ads is a commendable initiative aimed at protecting our vulnerable and populations and more. However, how can we ensure that this measure doesn't inadvertently give an advantage to foreign, international, and offshore betting apps that are not subject to Canadian regulations, potentially undermining the legal, regulated market in Canada? Have you looked into that concern?
Thank you for the question. And it's a good question. We've talked about it a little bit at the committee level and with other countries. And we have this, what we call traditional media that we're talking about in this bill. We have apps that are what we may call domestic apps that our folks, particularly our young people, have exposure to. And then we have what you're alluding to, which one could actually say is regulated, not regulated, international, unknown. And that's where these conversations, trying to get a deeper understanding with our partners in gaming, both domestically and globally, on how they're managing it, how they're handling it, what are some of the things that we can do and what can we not control. Because you don't want to fix one problem and create another. And I think that's what you're alluding to. But there seems to be some information and some strategies that we can learn from some countries that are a few years ahead of us on this.
You have another question?
Well, I like your comment that international research does indicate that the most effective approach is to limit these ads rather than implement a full ban. And I share your concern when you're watching a hockey game or you're watching TV, the ads come on and you got the superstars, and it is a major concern for all the reasons you've mentioned. But we live in an international market where our youth don't watch traditional TV. Even when it comes to NFL football, when it comes to hockey, we live in that world, but they don't. And, there's so many, when you go on the internet, there's so many offshore apps, so many international apps from all over the world, and they do have the stars advertising. So could our framework implement, how do you mitigate those risks? I mean, those are major concerns because they're the ones that are targeting our youth, right?
Thank you for that, and it's an excellent point. And that we were questioning in committee with some of our witnesses, and that becomes what is it we can do to control that. Some of the piece was talking about how you use access with credit card, how you do these age, there's a bunch of sort of parameters as you go in and go on. Some countries are using well, some companies are saying we're all over this, and we have some ways in which we can screen young people out. And young people is what we're trying to focus on here. And so there was even discussion of, debit versus credit, some of the steps they have to go through them online. So that conversation is like fluid right now. It's live right now. What can be done to try to, the bill, the target of the bill is advertising. But I see what your concern is of some of the implications. But those are the real conversations. And our partners are saying, we've got this. Like we're trying to show responsible gambling from the companies. They're working at some levers they can do to tighten in the reins on who's getting online, who's getting on these apps. And so it's to be acknowledged, and I know that it's a work in place. And when you have the government putting a framework together, you heard me talk about 1, 2, and 3 in the consultation. That number 2 there is going to be where they'll be working with international bodies.
Senator Housakos.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais prendre l'ajournement du débat.
I move the adjournment of the debate in my name. The Honourable Senator Housakos moves, seconded by the Honourable Senator Seidman, that the debate be placed on the order paper at the next sitting of the Senate.
Senators to adopt the motion. Carried, adopted.